Hey, this is Josie Ong with Affirmation Pod, your home for personal development, where I create actionable content that you can try before you hit the sack tonight. Before I get into this week's episode, I want to say thank you to all of you who are leaving iTunes reviews for the podcast and for all of those of you who are leaving iTunes ratings for the podcast. So you don't actually have to leave a review. You can also just leave a rating. And I appreciate both, whether you've done both or just one. And I want to share one that recently came in. It's from M. Luo Souza. It says, "Stepping stone to creating your inner champion. I love this podcast. I've listened to all the episodes, and alongside all my other resources in my wellness toolbox, it has slowly shifted my rather harsh inner critic to more of my own inner champion. I absolutely recommend Josie Ong's Affirmation Pod. She gets it, and I feel like she gets what pain and suffering feels like. She offers one possible remedy in caring for the most important person in your life, the irreplaceable you. Thank you, Josie." Thank you, M. Luo Souza. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing such a thoughtful and meaningful review. And I love how you say inner champion, because we do. We all have an inner critic and we all have an inner champion. And I love all the effort you're putting in, not just with my podcast, but like you say, using your wellness toolbox to shift from the inner critic to the inner champion. If you would like to leave a rating, and the ratings in iTunes are on a scale of 1 to 5. So essentially 5 stars, you highly recommend it. 1 star, you don't recommend it. And you can pick where you're on the spectrum in between as well. Go to affirmationpod.com/iTunes, which will take you to the page where you can click to view the podcast in iTunes. And then if you click on ratings and reviews, that's where you can leave your rating. Now to today's episode, which is wrapping up our theme on reflections. I originally wanted to have in this episode something called 3 tips when seeing a therapist. And it wasn't going to be about how to find a therapist or what are all those letters after people's names when you look them up on the internet. What do they mean and how do I figure out who is what and what is who? It was more of how could you communicate within the therapy setting that would help you get more out of the therapy. And it was partly inspired by a place I used to present at. I would go there every 3 months. It was a 3-month program. It was a transition home. And I'd say around half of the people there, because they had completed a recovery program before they got there. So rehab, after rehab, they go to this transition home. But half were not from a substance or process addiction situation. One fellow shared with me that he was there because his wife had been diagnosed with cancer and he had done everything he could to get her the best treatment in the world, including selling their home, selling their vacation home. And as he spoke with me, his sadness, his grief was written all over him. And he showed me a photocopy of his marriage certificate with her and a photo of her. And he said, after everything I did, she died. And if there's one word I could use to describe him, he looked lost. He just looked so lost. I don't even think he cared about getting back on his feet with housing and all of those things. He really needed to find something to anchor him through the grieving process. Another fellow, he was a young fellow. He was in his 20s. He told me he had an MBA, just got a really great job, really great income, and really happy. However, he had relatives who were involved with some investment things and I guess essentially some scams, and they got him involved and he both lent them money as well as invested some of his own money and ended up losing everything. And that's why he was in a transition home. Now, I share about this place with you because, like I said earlier, it's a 3-month program. And one mandatory part of the program is you would be assigned a counselor, a therapist that you would see weekly. And I would come in as a guest speaker every 3 months to the group that was going through the program at the time. And they would often ask me during the Q&A stuff about my presentation, but also about therapy and counseling. And what I picked up on is that some people there were not happy or were not or they didn't like going to their session. And because they knew I was a therapist, they wanted some guidance or just some tips or direction. And for them, it was a tricky situation. They signed up for this program and they didn't get a say in who their counselor or therapist would be. Basically, it was whoever had openings based on who had graduated out of the program. And I would give them some tips. And I started thinking about this episode. I started reflecting on it, which is the theme for this month, reflections. And I thought, what about just making the episode a little broader and share some of my reflections on advocating for yourself, standing up for yourself. We all have had times and situations where we haven't done that, right? As I was reflecting, I totally remembered a situation where I applied for a position at a counseling practice that had a pretty good reputation in the community. I didn't know too much about it except the executive director. I'd heard her speak a couple times and she was like this awesome speaker. And I thought, even just to be mentored under her would be cool. And so I applied for the job. It was like pretty rigorous. They don't just interview you. They have you do a mock counseling session with one of the counselors, like a pretend session. And the rest of the counseling team is like watching you from a one-way mirror. So you can't see them, but they can see you and they're all evaluating you. And it was just very intense. Yeah. And in a way, it kind of made me want it more. And I got a position there. It was really cool. And one part of their program, if you were contracted there, is that if you're a junior counselor, which I was, you would be partnered up with a senior counselor who would supervise you, oversee you, and observe some of your counseling sessions with clients. And the clients, when they go to this practice, they're informed that some of the sessions will be observed through the cameras, and they sign a form agreeing to that. And then junior counselors, there's an amount that comes off our paycheck that goes to the senior counselor for the time that they meet with us. Well, when I look back and when I reflect at that season of my life and that time, I wasn't connecting well with the senior counselor I was assigned. And I didn't advocate for myself as I could have. And if it was me now, I would have. But back then I didn't. I think I was just a little bit, starstruck that I actually got the position there. And it's a situation where I probably could have asked to be switched to a different senior counselor. But I don't know. It was hard. But I do remember one time I did kind of call her out because she wouldn't remember the names of my clients. And maybe she wasn't good with names, but she would call them things like, oh, the cheater, or the depressed one, or the gay guy. And I remember one time I said, why don't you refer to him by his name? His name's, let's say, Billy. And she said, yeah, but your brain always goes to the positive with all your sessions. You don't go deep enough into their issues. And whether that's true or not about me, maybe sometimes I do think of people's strengths and not get into the dirty laundry as quickly or as much as she would if she was the counselor. It's hard for me. It's hard looking back. And what ended up happening there was not long after I was hired, that executive director, the one I was like, oh, it'd be so cool if I could be mentored by her and stuff, she took a sabbatical leave. And there were things going on there that I don't remember at all. I remember how I felt. And I felt it was just a very uncomfortable situation for me, especially because I really liked the clients and I liked the work I was doing with them and the feedback I was getting from them. However, I resigned. And that was before the executive director came back from her sabbatical. It was just not a fit for me. And so this episode's a lot different from anything I've ever really done, I think. It's simply reflections. I don't even know what to categorize this episode at this point. My homework for you is to think about situations that may not be a good fit for you now and what you want to do. It doesn't mean you would resign like I did from that organization that I was contracted with, but it might. And if it's not something you want to leave, how can you advocate for yourself? How can you stand up for yourself? How can you draw some lines? And so I think the title of this episode is going to be Advocating for Yourself. And I encourage you to reflect on lessons you've learned from times when you haven't advocated for yourself and ways you have advocated for yourself and how you can exercise those muscles again in present life, in today's world, and sharing your perspective and asking for what you need. One of my undergrad professors said something that I didn't really like when I heard it, but I get where she's coming from now. She said, we really do train people to treat us a certain way. And so where we draw the line, what we're okay with and what we're not, people will adapt and adjust accordingly. And I'm going to leave the episode at that. If you have any questions or reflections you want to share, feel free, email me, josie@affirmationpod.com. Also, if you haven't checked out my online course for self-awareness, self-reflection through journaling, it's called Journaling Pod. Take a look at journalingpod.com, and you can use the promo code REFLECT to get $100 off. This is Josie with Affirmation Pod, your home for personal development. Thank you so much for clicking play and connecting in today. I hope you leave this episode inspired to advocate for yourself in a new way in one area of your life. I'll catch you on the next episode on time management. Bye for now.